Hey guys, so here's a quick midterm review for the lecture. Okay, a quick lecture midterm review. So remember that anatomy is going to be the study of external and internal structures, right? So we're looking at this relationship between body parts, right? So we have a careful observation of the human body, and it does give clues about physiological functions, right? But again, it's like the structure, right, of what's outside and what's inside. Now, when we're looking at anatomy, we can divide anatomy up into many things like gross anatomy, which you can see basically with your naked eye, and then like microscopic anatomy. And microscopic anatomy is the study of structures that you can't see with your naked eye, right? So you have to use some type of magnification, like a light microscope, for example, right? And so remember, there's going to be some just vocab words. Cytology means the study of cells. Cyte means cells. Ology means the study of. Okay, so cytology is the study of cells. Remember, histology is the study of tissues. Histo means tissues. Okay, and so when we're looking at anatomical landmarks and just anatomical positions, remember we're standing with our feet flat on the floor and our hands at our sides. Palms are facing forward, right? That's anatomical position. But supine, right? So say, for example, if you just push that person on the ground, right? And in an anatomical position, a supine position would be they're laying down, right? But their face is up in anatomical position. So face up, palms up in anatomical position. Now prone is the opposite, right? You're laying down, but your face is down, right? And you can see like the back or the posterior of the hands, right? And remember, we are able to separate things in the abdominal region into different quadrants. Okay. We have the right upper quadrant, as you can see right here, left upper quadrant, left lower quadrant, right lower quadrant. Okay, and then we can further divide those quadrants up into different regions, as you can see right here. So just remember the different quadrants and regions, as well as, you know, the organs that are going to be located in those different quadrants and regions. Okay. Now, when we're looking at anatomical directions, right? So we use the most common anatomical directions, right? Superior, right, means toward the head, right? Inferior means toward the feet, okay? Anterior means the front. Posterior means the back, right? So for anterior, sometimes we might use the word ventral. Anterior, ventral means front. For posterior, we sometimes might use dorsal. Posterior, dorsal means back. Okay? Medial means toward the midline, whereas lateral is the opposite, is away from the midline, right? Superficial is what you can see, right? That's on the outside. Deep is further within the body. Okay? Proximal means toward the attached base, right? Whereas distal means away from that attached base, right? So your hip is more proximal compared to your knee, okay? Or your toes are more distal compared to your ankle, okay? So remember those anatomical directions. This just gives you more anatomical directions. Now, when we're going to the cephalad or the cephalic region, that's going towards the head. If we're going towards more caudal, right? More caudal means to the tailbone. Okay, that's going to be for the tailbone. Okay, so remember that. Cephalad means head, or cephalic, okay? Now, there are different cuts, different planes, right? So, as you can see here, right, this frontal, right, we're cutting them right there, right? That frontal plane is going to give you an anterior and a posterior portion of the body, right? This sagittal cut, right, that's going to give you a left and a right portion of the body. Now, this transverse cut, you cut them right there like that, right? That's going to give you a superior and an inferior portion, like a top and a bottom, okay, to the body. Now, we also can divide the body up into different cavities. So the body can first be divided into two major cavities. That's going to be the posterior cavity. Posterior cavity is going to be that dorsal cavity, which is going to consist of the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity, where your brain and your spinal cord will lie respectively. And we have the anterior cavity, which is the ventral cavity, right? We have the thoracic cavity up here, right? And that's going to then be further divided into the pleural cavity and the pericardial cavity. And we have the abdominal cavity. And the abdominal cavity is going to contain those visceral organs, and it's going to be separated from the thoracic cavity via that diaphragm. Okay, and then of course around here we have the pelvic cavity, and sometimes we just put the pelvic cavity with the abdominal cavity, and we just call it the abdominal pelvic cavity. And the pelvic cavity is going to contain those reproductive organs and your bladder, things like that. Okay, this just goes over it again. The thoracic cavity, we're going to have 2 pleural cavities, right, for each lung. We're going to have a pericardial cavity as well that's going to contain the heart. We're going to have this diaphragm right here that's going to separate the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavities. And again, abdominal cavities contain those digestive glands, organs, your stomach, things like that. Your pelvic cavity is going to contain your urinary bladder, reproductive organs, and the end portion of your digestive tract. Okay. Remember these serous membranes. Remember, visceral means organ, so a visceral pericardium, right, or visceral pleural cavity, right? They're going to be directly on the organ, okay? And so, right, so remember those visceral layers are going to be on the organ. The parietal layer is going to be on the chest wall, okay? And then between these 2 layers, right, you're going to have that fluid. And if we're talking about the pericardial cavity, right, it's going to have the visceral pericardium, the parietal pericardium, and then in the middle right here, right, you're going to have that pericardial fluid, right? And if it's the lungs, you're going to have the pleural fluid within that pleural cavity, okay? Now, looking at the cell, remember the cell, right? The basic unit of life, right? The cell is going to contain many organelles, and these organelles are basically like little organs, like how your organs do certain functions in your body. Your organelles do certain functions within your cell, right? To maintain, make sure your cell is working, okay? So, of course, you have the cell membrane, right? The cell membrane is going to separate the cell, right? Separate the internal components of the cell from the external environment. Within the cell membrane, right, we have the components of the cell, right? So inside the cell, we have this cytosol. The cytosol is this fluid component of the cytoplasm, right? We also have ribosomes, right? Ribosomes are very important because ribosomes, they help to synthesize proteins, right? We're able to make proteins on these ribosomes, okay? The mitochondria. Now we're going to get into membranous organelles. So organelles that have like a double membrane, or organelles that have a membrane for the most part, right? So the mitochondria specifically is a double membrane structure, and it helps to produce a lot of ATP for the cell, right? So it helps to produce a lot of energy for the cell. You have the nucleus that's going to control metabolism. It has stores, processes our genetic information, right? Controls protein synthesis. We have the endoplasmic reticulum. That's where we're going to have, the rough and the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The rough endoplasmic reticulum just has ribosomes on it. It just has this rough appearance, as you can see right here, right? It just has these little dots on them, and that's the ribosomes. And again, the rough endoplasmic reticulum is the site of protein synthesis because it has those ribosomes on it. This portion right here, this is the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. It does not have ribosomes on it, but it is going to be important for like lipid and steroids, like how we make lipids and steroids and fats in the body, okay? We also have this structure up here, named after Mr. Golgi, the Golgi apparatus, right? This is a structure, an organelle, membranous organelle, right? That helps to store, alter, and package these proteins, right? We also have lysosomes, right? Now these lysosomes, right, as you can see right here, like this little green one, right? These lysosomes, these are just vesicles that contains digestive enzymes, and they remove damaged organelles or pathogens that enter the cell. Okay, so remember these different organelles, right? And I go over them just right here again, right? Ribosomes, protein synthesis, endoplasmic reticulum, right? Protein synthesis where it's the rough, lipid and steroid synthesis if it's smooth. Okay, Golgi apparatus plays a role in packaging these proteins, right? Whether they need to get to the cell membrane or get out of the cell. Then you have lysosomes. Again, they're going to contain these digestive enzymes that will help to destroy what does not need to be in the cell anymore. Okay. Now, when we're looking at our membrane, right, we know we have a double membrane as a phospholipid bilayer. That's what our membranes are in our cells. Now, specifically, if a membrane is non-permeable, right, or impermeable, nothing crosses that membrane, right? It's impermeable. If it's freely permeable, anything can cross without difficulty. Now, our membranes are selectively permeable, right? So we'll allow certain things in and we'll inhibit other things from crossing over, right? So we're very, very selective when it comes to that, because you don't want anything just entering your cell and you don't want everything exiting your cell, right? Now, when we're looking at membrane permeability, there is diffusion, right? So remember, diffusion is the movement of molecules, right? So whenever it talks about diffusion, remember it's talking about the molecules, right? And again, we're moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, okay? So again, diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Okay. Now, when we're talking about osmosis, osmosis deals with water. Okay. Now, osmosis is the diffusion of water, right, from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration. But if we're looking at this image right here, yeah, there's high water in here, and that water is going to move out. But also pay attention to the solutes, though. Right? It's a little solutes inside, but it's a lot of solutes outside. Water will always go where there's a lot of stuff or a lot of solutes are. So yes, osmosis is the movement of water from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration. It's also the net movement of water from an area of low solute concentration to an area of high solute concentration. Okay? When we're looking at the life cycle of a cell, this is how the cell will make a new of itself, right? Make a copy of itself, okay? Through cell division. These are the steps of cell division. We have interphase, right? This is interphase. Your cell will typically spend most of its life in interphase portion, right? And this is where the cell is just having its normal functions. It's growing, it's duplicating some organelles, or synthesizing some proteins. You're replicating your DNA, things like that. And then we have M phase, which is mitosis. This is going to be one part of the entire process of cell reproduction. But in mitosis, we start with prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. And then after mitosis, we end with cytokinesis. Okay? And that's where we have that cleavage furrow, and then we have two new identical cells. And this just goes over it right here, right? Interphase, DNA strands are loosely coiled, chromosome can't be seen. Prophase, right, is the prophase. This is where that nuclear envelope starts to deform, goes away. The centrosomes start to have their centrioles attach those spindle fibers to the centromeres. These chromosomes, they start to condense. Now we can see them, things like that. In metaphase, you have these chromosomes being pulled and aligned on that metaphase plate, really to the middle of the cell. Then you have anaphase. These chromosomes are being pulled apart. That's why they look like little V's, right? Because they're getting pulled apart from one way, getting pulled apart to the opposite poles of the cell. In telophase, you have now these chromosomes are on the opposite poles of the cell, right? And what happens is telophase is basically just the opposite of prophase. Now in prophase, that nuclear envelope deformed. Now in telophase, that nuclear envelope is reforming. Those chromosomes are now uncondensing now, okay? And then cytokinesis is where that cleavage furrow starts to come in, gets between the two separated nuclei, and now we have two new identical cells, okay? And now moving on to tissues of the body, right? Just simply we know that looking at the makeup of life, atoms will combine to make molecules. Molecules interact to form cells. Cells combine to form tissues. Tissues are just a specialized collection of cells. Tissues then form to create organ systems, organs, right? Sorry. And then organs create organ systems. Organ systems make up us as an organism, right? And we talked about epithelial tissue. There's two types of layering. There's simple epithelium, where there's just only one layering, and then there's stratified epithelium, and that's just basically two or more cells, right? when we're looking at this, this is what it looks like, right? So just one layer is simple stratified. I'm sorry. One layer is simple squamous cells. Squamous is those flattened cells, right? Pancake sandwich type cells. And then you have stratified squamous epithelium, right? It's just those sandwiched cells, and but it's just multiple layers of them. Stratified and simple just refers to the layering. Again, simple means one layer. Stratified means two or more layers. Squamous refers to the shape, and that's going to be like flat, right? We do have transitional epithelium. Remember transitional epithelium? You're going to find this in the urinary bladder, like the renal pelvis, the ureters, things like that in the urinary system. But this transitional epithelium is really important because it permits the expansion and recoil after stretching. So your bladder, right, it needs to stretch because it fills up with urine. But in these cells, right, this transitional epithelium, they can transition, basically. They can expand and get larger, and then they can recoil, come back to their original shape. Okay, that's transitional epithelium. Okay, when we're looking at connective tissue, right, we have connective tissue proper, which is forms of loose and dense connective tissue. We have fluid connective tissue, which is going to be our blood and lymph fluid. Excuse me. And we also have supporting connective tissue. Supporting connective tissue is bone, cartilage, things like that. Okay, remember, bone is a type of supporting connective tissue. Now, the epidermis, right, part of the cutaneous membrane, the epidermis is going to be primarily composed of stratified squamous epithelium. Okay, remember that. Epidermis is composed of stratified squamous epithelium. Okay, so it's multiple layers of this flattened type of cell. When we're looking at the skeletal system, right, the skeletal system can be divided into two divisions, axial and appendicular skeleton. Right? The skeletal system provides the framework for the attachment of other organs, and we're also able to store a huge amount of calcium, right? 98% of the body's calcium is going to be on bones, and we're also able to store phosphate ions in bones as well, right? Here are the functions of the skeletal system, right? We're able to make blood cells, right? Our blood cells are made in our bone marrow, right? The erythrocytes, such as the red blood cells, the leukocytes, the white blood cells, and the platelets, we all make this in our bone marrow. Right? Bones act as levers, right? So muscles pull on the bones to produce movement. They protect, right? Your skeletal system definitely protects, right? Your ribs protect your heart and your lungs. Your skull protects your brain. Your vertebrae protects your spinal cord. Those pelvic bones, they protect those reproductive organs, right? Here are the cells of bones, right? Remember we have now follow along with me. We have these osteoprogenitor cells, or these osteogenic cells. These are those stem cells. And basically they will differentiate to form osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are these immature bone cells. They're going to be found in the inner and outer surfaces of bones, but they produce osteoid, right? And this is involved in making that bone matrix. So they make the bone matrix, so they build bone, right? So osteoblasts build bone. However, when these osteoblasts are surrounded by this matrix, they actually mature and become osteocytes, right? And these osteocytes, these are now mature bones, and they maintain the bone matrix, okay? They monitor and maintain the bone matrix. And then we have osteoclasts, class with a C as in cat. And what they do is they break down bone, okay? In the process of resorption, right? So they break down bone. Osteoclasts break down bone. Okay. Now, when we're looking at the axial skeleton is made up of the skull bones, auditory ossicles, the hyoid bone, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. Excuse me. Whereas the appendicular skeleton, right, it's going to be like your limbs, right? The appendages. It's going to contain your limbs, like your arm, legs, things like that, as well as your pectoral and your pelvic girdle. Okay.
Moving further, we have sutures, right?
It was double me for a second, right? Sutures, right? They're going to be made up of dense fibrous connective tissue. You have the lambdoid suture, right? That lambdoid suture is going to be between the occipital bones and the two parietal bones that we can see. You have that sagittal suture that's going to separate the two parietal bones. And then we have that coronal suture, right? And that's going to be the suture between the frontal bone and the two paired parietal bones, okay? And again, the appendicular skeleton, I know I mentioned it before, here it is again, is going to be containing your pectoral girdle. Your pectoral girdle is those shoulder bones, your clavicle, and the scapula, really. And it's going to contain your upper limbs, all right, both upper limbs. It's going to contain that pelvic girdle, which is going to be your hip bones. Okay, let's just say right here and right here, right? Those are your hip bones. And then also appendicular skeleton contains your lower limbs too, right? Remember different joints, right? Joints can be classified based on their function, which is their range of motion. You have synarthrotic joints, synarthrosis, or synarthrotic joints. These are immovable, right? This is where two bones will fuse together, such as your skull. Amphiarthrosis, they're slightly movable, still stiff, but still slightly movable though, right? An example of an amphiarthrosis, right? Joint would be a symphysis, like that pubic symphysis, right? And then diarthrosis, these are those synovial joints, and these are all freely movable because they contain a synovial capsule, which contains synovial fluid. Okay. When we're looking at the skeletal system, there's three types of muscle tissues. When we're looking at the muscular system, right, we have three types of muscle tissue. There is skeletal muscle that helps to pull on skeletal bones, and we have voluntary contraction of skeletal muscles, right? We have cardiac muscle, right, that helps to push the blood through the arteries and the veins. That's going to make up your heart. And we have smooth muscle, and smooth muscle helps to push fluids and solids along your digestive tract, for example, or it's lining those hollow organs, right? Your digestive tract lines your vessels, your blood vessels, things like that. However, for cardiac and smooth muscle, these are involuntary, right? However, for skeletal, voluntary, conscious control, okay, over your skeletal muscles. Now, here are the functions of skeletal muscles. We produce skeletal movement, so we pull on tendons to move bones. We maintain posture and body position. We support soft tissues. We regulate the entering and exiting of material, and we maintain body temperature, right? So remember these 5 functions of skeletal muscles. And of course, those skeletal muscles are going to be wrapped around by connective tissue. So remember the epimysium. Epimysium is going to be that dense connective tissue layer that surrounds the entire muscle. The perimysium that we see right here, the perimysium is that dense connective tissue that divides the muscles into parallel compartments, right, of fascicles. And it's this perimysium that covers a muscle fascicle. And again, a muscle fascicle is a bundle of cells, bundle of muscle cells. And then if we look in a little bit more deep, right, we have the endomysium. The endomysium is this dense connective tissue that surrounds an individual muscle fiber, okay, the endomysium. So we have epimysium covering the entire muscle, perimysium covering a muscle fascicle, and then endomysium covering individual muscle cell. Okay. Remember, when we're looking at a muscle, right, it has many myofibrils, and that's what you can see here, all those red dots. These red dots are just myofibrils right there. Now, those myofibrils are made up of just simply repeating units, right, of sarcomeres, okay? Again, these myofibrils are just made up of repeating units of sarcomeres. So when we're looking at deep into a muscle, I also want you to remember that triad too. That triad is the 2 cisternal ends of the sarcoplasmic reticulum and this T-tubule, right? So again, that triad means 3, right? It's the 2 ends, right? The 2, I should say, cisternae ends, and it's the 1 T-tubule. Okay, that's what a triad is. Okay, when we're looking at a sarcomere, these are going to be those contractile units of a muscle. Remember the A band right here is going to contain both thick and thin filaments. Remember, just as a recap, thin filaments equals actin, right? Actin is our thin filament. Our thick filament is myosin. Okay, the A band consists of both thick and thin filaments. The I band is just thin, right? It's the zone of overlap within that A band, though. That's why it's both thick and thin filaments. However, it's this H band right here. H band is only thick filament, okay? A sarcomere will extend from Z disc to Z disc, right? So this is one sarcomere, Z disc to Z disc, and then we have another one, and then we have another one, things like that, okay? Now looking at the the muscular system. Just like how the skeletal system is divided into axial and appendicular, the muscular system is also divided into axial and appendicular. Axial musculature is the muscles that move the head and the vertebral column, and the muscles that move the rib cage. Appendicular musculature is the muscles that stabilize or move the appendicular skeleton. And of course, all of these muscles are going to be innervated by nerves. Remember this diaphragm, right? This diaphragm is innervated by the phrenic nerve, okay? Remember these muscles that make up the rotator cuff, right? It's going to be the subscapularis that you can see right here. It's also going to be the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor. Remember these muscles, okay? Some you can call them tis, right? So for teres minor, infraspinatus, supraspinatus, and then subscapularis, right? These are those tis muscles that make up the rotator cuff. Remember looking at the muscles that move the forearm and the hand, okay? I want you to remember the extensors at the elbow, right? These extensors at the elbow is going to be the triceps muscles and the aconius muscle, okay? These are going to be the muscles that move the forearm and the hand, extensors of the elbow, or I should say extensors at the elbow, right? And then looking at extensors at the knee, right? The extensors at the knee is going to be those three vastus muscles, right? And the rectus femoris, okay? They're going to help to extend the leg at the knee, okay? And these are going to be called your quadriceps femoris, right? The extensors of the knee is going to be those quadriceps femoris. Now, the flexors of the knee, right? These are going to help to flex the leg at the knee. These are going to be the biceps femoris, the semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus muscles. And these are commonly called your hamstring muscles, okay? Your hamstring muscles, okay? And that was the lecture midterm review, okay?